I'd like to introduce Beth Mund, who's standing up here over here next to me. Beth Mund is the Executive Director of the Stories of Space Project and the Chief Narrative Officer of her company, Stellar Communications. She's also the host and creator of Casual Space podcasts. She's an expert on showcasing the narratives of space leaders, innovators, and explorers, is a sought-after host for several international conferences, as well as a space communication advisor. Beth is a former NASA Public Affairs Officer for the Johnson Space Center and International Space Station Communications Officer, and has served as a Science Communications Officer on 2 analog astronaut simulated missions, and will be serving her next analog this October. Beth's most recent work, projects and missions, can be found on www.bethmund.com. Beth, take it away.
Well, thank you, and thank you so much for having us and gathering all of us, Felix. This is fantastic. Before I introduce the panel, I want to just introduce you to my latest project because we can all participate. I did spend several years at NASA, and never ever did I think that one day I would not just talk the talk, but walk the walk amongst the scientists. And I feel honored to share with you our new program, which is the Stories of Space Project. Last year, around this time, I had the idea of taking the stories that I gather each week from my podcast that are your stories, the stories from everyone in the industry, especially the leaders, who just have this genuine love for space, and they have their own narrative. But that narrative only lives when we share it. And those things don't get shared enough, in my opinion. So I took 100 invitations, which ended up to be 300 solicited and submitted stories. I put them on 55 micro SD cards, and they are currently on board the International Space Station as we speak, which, by the way, there are some viewing opportunities here in the Chicagoland area this weekend. So go to nasa.gov, type in your address, and you'll be able to see, as you know, the station as it orbits above us every 90 minutes. But at night, there are some viewing opportunities here in Chicago. So my payload and your stories are on space. And we just opened the story window for the next submission of stories. All right, so now let's introduce the panel. We have such great guests today. I'm very excited to chat with them. First, we have David Hurst. He's the CEO of Orbital Transports, a space logistics company focused on delivering small satellite missions. David is a technology innovator, a successful entrepreneur, 30-year software engineer, and in 2013, he left the IT industry to follow his passion for space. He founded Orbital Transports, working with private and government development, and he founded New Space Chicago, an open community of entrepreneurs, professionals, students, and others that engaged in building commercial space here in Chicago and in the Midwest. How many of you are familiar with New Space Chicago? Okay, I hope you reach out to David before you leave and make sure you join. Next, we have Charles Mudd. Charles is the founder and principal of Mudd Law, recognized internationally for space-focused litigation and transactional practice. For more than 20 years, he's represented clients at the forefront of space technology and internet technology. Charles advocates for developing inclusive and sustainable space policy. He's spoken at United Nations conferences about space law and policy. He is a member of the International Institute of Space Law, American Astronomical Society, and he's completed graduate classes in astrophysics and is working towards a Master's of Science in Data Analytics at the University of Chicago. He also serves on the board at New Space Chicago, and he teaches Internet and Space Law. We have today with us as well Ken Savin. He's the chief scientific officer at Redwire. I love this description you have on your site, a company that builds things for NASA. Before Redwire, he was the director at CASIS, the Center for the Advancement of Science in Space, and he worked at Eli Lilly and Company. Ken, you've been a PI on past experiments on station, an advisor to those experiments, and currently you're working on crystal production for semiconductors and for pharmaceuticals. So today is very much a conversation. We have a few things we'd love to get started with. And David, I'd like to start with you. I'm going to join you if you don't mind. Bring the mic here and sit with you guys. David, can you walk us through what space logistics is?
Sure. So the traditional definition of space logistics is orchestrating the complex elements of space vehicles, people, facilities, products, and services in order to deliver a mission. Typically, you might think of that as I'm getting a satellite onto a rocket, getting the rocket fueled, putting the rocket in space, and that satellite is then put into orbit. But the space industry is changing today, and now we're seeing a lot of development of logistics into on-orbit capabilities directly. So, for example, in the past, if you put a satellite into space, you had to make sure that you anticipated every possible thing that might happen. And if something went wrong, that was it. Nobody could get there to fix it. You couldn't make repairs. You couldn't upgrade the spacecraft. But now we're developing technologies to do on-orbit servicing, which means that I can actually go to that spacecraft with a servicing spacecraft. And maybe if something went wrong, I can inspect it and see that a solar panel didn't deploy properly and help that deploy. Or I can refuel a spacecraft. It used to be that when a spacecraft ran out of fuel, the mission was done, even if the spacecraft was still operational. Without propellant, you can't maintain station, you're basically space junk. And so the spacecraft needed to be deorbited or moved to somewhere else. If I can refuel that spacecraft, I can extend its life, I can make it last much longer. And so we're starting to see these kinds of on-orbit capabilities developing now, and I see massive opportunities for innovation in the space logistics area.
Fantastic. Moving from logistics to law. What is space law?
Space law is, it's interesting that many people come up to me and say, I never knew that was a thing. Did that just start? And in fact, space law goes back pretty much to basically pre-Sputnik. Space law is a way of describing the areas of law that are specifically related to space. But a lot of times in representing my space law clients, there's also the boring general work of drafting contracts, negotiating agreements, and so forth, as opposed to the regulatory side, which really gets me going. So it's a way of describing the area of law that is specifically focused on space, but within that, it's a wide berth of topics, anywhere from export control, which is really significant in the United States, and some people would argue that the United States export laws right now are constraining the ability for US companies and foreign companies to collaborate and do business with one another. So that's one issue. Earth observation through NOAA licensing. If you're looking at Earth on a satellite, even if it's the 18 or the 8 or 16-bit block pixels that some of us may remember from video games, you still need an Earth remote sensing license. And then you have FCC, FAA, and the list goes on.
My husband works in export control. I barely swim in it and try not to touch it. It's pretty
fun.
involved. It is fun. So from logistics to space law, I know one of the questions I got asked at NASA all the time was, well, how does this impact our daily lives here on Earth? This is so incredible. We get to really put things in test research and do big, bold things. But how does it apply to us? And Ken, that's where you come in. Can you walk us through how that process can easily be applied?
So starting maybe right around the time the space station was being completed, Congress was worried that they were building this thing. That's $150 billion or whatever it cost to build it. And they knew they would, every year at least $1 or $2 billion is being invested into it to maintain it. They knew that they had to do something that the American people would see as a benefit to them. So they created half the US portion of the space station as a national lab. So that puts it in control of Congress to sort of organize how it will be operated and what it will be used for. And they also created a program for people at universities or in industry to submit projects that would ultimately have some benefit to people on Earth. So I participated in that as a principal investigator when I was still at Eli Lilly and Company. We ran experiments that informed work that we were doing leading up to products going to market or would help us develop products. And I also worked as part of that, the agency was created by this act of Congress called CASIS, which is the Center for the Advancement of Science and Space. And it's a not-for-profit that is funded through NASA dollars to allow anybody to do projects in space, well, pretty much. In fact, I was working, I went on to work there, and a young woman who met me, oddly enough, at a bar, and she wasn't old enough to drink. She was probably at the time 19, 20. She was a University of Chicago student. Not that that's a bad thing, but the odd thing was we were both there because she, as a high school student, submitted an experiment to be run on the space station. It was being launched. And I, towards the end of my career in the pharmaceutical industry, was doing the same. And we met at this bar. Her mom was there, but she ended up being my intern. And that, for me, seeing a really young person who, when she gets together with her friends, talks about putting something in space like going to the mall, the whole field has been democratized versus what it was like during shuttle or before when it was NASA, did everything, and you couldn't touch them. And now normal people are calling us up saying, hey, we want to do something. And it's companies that are part of our lives that are like Adidas. They've flown a couple of experiments. They looked at how a ball rotates, which I thought was kind of a flimsy idea for a science experiment, but they sell more than $250 million worth of soccer balls every year. And at the beginning of the Premier League season, all the potential soccer balls that would be used by Premier League are tested by the Premier League athletes, and that's big money. So that was something that I think brings it down to us, to something that we'll see and we touch perhaps every day.
Fantastic. Great story. And so I got out of that, if you're a student, go to the bar.
Go to the bar. Yeah.
Actually, I do want to share, if I may, if you are a student, there are so many opportunities right now for fellowships. There's the Matthew Isakowitz and the Brooke Owens, which are fellowships that take students in the aerospace industry and directly mentor you and put you in line with programs of the big space startups and the big space companies. And right now, NASA's also doing a call out for the 2024 interns. So it's a great time to be a student. And even if it's not your field at NASA and you get a NASA internship and they put you in a field that, say, is geology or, heaven forbid, public affairs, it really goes a long way. You get a lot of opportunities there. So I'd like to tie back into the satellite, small satellite, because it's this $1 trillion growing, booming, soon to be trillions of dollars industry. How can innovations on small satellites benefit us here on Earth? It seems like something that is so far away up there in space, but really it's here.
That's right. It used to be that if you were going to build a satellite, it was going to cost you billions of dollars and take you many years to design it, and then it would go up into geosynchronous orbit. And it would be, for example, the Landsat satellite from NASA would collect information, and then that would eventually be filtered down to something that people would be able to use. But let me ask you a couple of things. Did you use a GPS today to get here? That's information coming directly from space. Were you tracking the hurricane in Florida that just hit and unfortunately prevented one of our participants today from being here? We were aware that that was going to happen last week, right? Where did that information come from? That information came from space as well. I can pick up my cell phone and talk to somebody on the other side of the world immediately. We take all of these capabilities for granted, but all of those things are coming from space. And the small satellite revolution has enabled us to rapidly develop new technologies and put them into space and see that iteration cycle that we've seen on the ground. Everybody knows how rapidly computer technologies have developed over the last couple of decades. Well, that is now happening in space because small satellites have a much shorter iteration cycle. So I can develop something, put it in space, see what happens, and then develop the next iteration in a matter of months or maybe a year, as opposed to the decade-long cycles that we used to have. So that's at just sort of the level of hardware being deployed into orbit. But as we have more and more satellites in low Earth orbit collecting data about the Earth, there is a whole opportunity for what we call edge computing in space. And this is putting more intelligence into the satellites themselves. And so we can now develop an application, upload it into a constellation, and start identifying information about the planet really in real time. So we have customers, for example, who are deploying applications to identify illegal fishing boats in the Gulf of Thailand. We have identifying wildfires in the western US. The number of applications is just amazing, but the ability to pivot rapidly is what is really driving innovation. And I'll give you a good example of that. It seems like forever ago now because we've had so many disasters since then, but last January of 22, you may remember that there was an enormous volcanic explosion in the South Pacific. That was an emergent phenomenon. Nobody was expecting it. Nobody was able to predict it. But we were able to bring to bear satellite information very rapidly, and people were uploading new applications to analyze what was happening basically in real time and collecting new information about what's going on in our dynamic and changing planet. So these are the kinds of innovations that are being driven by the small satellite revolution.
Fantastic. One of the things I'm really excited to dig into, I wish we had the whole session about this maybe in the future, is how when we go to space, although we think of space as infinite, really low Earth orbit is limited in space. And as we go, we have to play nice, which means we have some rules, which introduces the Artemis Accords. Yes. I'm so excited to talk about this, but I first want to recognize and congratulate India for landing successfully on the South Pole. This is so incredible and just phenomenal, such a milestone. So as more and more people are racing to space, literally Space Race 2.0, how do we play nice and share?
Well, that's a really good question because space is used by a lot of people and a lot of industries. And in fact, you mentioned that I had taken graduate astrophysics classes in this building, and it's actually taking galaxies with Andrei Krausov that prompted my expansion into space law about 6 or 7 years ago. And so one area of playing nice that we don't really think about is, and I don't believe that people in the industry thought about, and certainly astronomers, if they thought about it, wasn't really vocalizing, is the solar reflectivity of satellites on ground-based astronomy. And if you've all, how many have seen the streak of Starlink satellites going across the night sky? And I have two perspectives. One, it's really cool when you think about it and you see the satellites going across. Then if I put my amateur astronomer hat on, it's like suddenly you're aghast that, oh my God, these lights are interfering with the ability to perceive beyond them and so forth. And that's one area. But then also the debris issue is something that had been talked about for years before. In fact, we've been talking about space debris or orbital debris, which basically means the same thing. It's really the US prefers orbital and the rest of the world uses space. We've been talking about it for 30 years, actually a little bit before that, but the first real US government focused approach was in the Clinton administration in 1993. And it was only recently, in the last few years, that the FCC arrived at a point where it started to impose requirements on applicants seeking an operational license of a satellite. So it's taken nearly 3 decades to get to that point. Some people would argue that the FCC has gone too far. And in fact, some people in Congress argue that the FCC has stepped way out of its purview. My perspective is whether it's the FCC, Congress, the Commerce Department, nobody was acting on it before. And there had been a prediction by, I think his first name's Robert, but it's Kessler, the Kessler syndrome, that we would get to a point where the number of objects in space would get so high, and the number of debris objects, that they would start colliding with one another and creating more debris, and then creating a cascading effect. Now, some contend that we're not there yet, that we're many years away, that we may never get there. But nonetheless, you've all perhaps seen earlier this week that there was, in fact, it was yesterday, that a colleague of mine, Jonathan McDowell, posted about a Russian defunct satellite being hit by debris. So it was a satellite, and if it's end of life or end of mission and it's still up there, it's not working. That's a debris object. So we are getting to the point where debris is hitting debris. The ISS has had to move out of the way of not only debris, it's been hit by debris, but also Starlink satellites. So in answer to your question, we really need to get to a point where we have a regulatory environment, not just in the US, but worldwide, that protects the interests of space for all involved. The small satellites, so that they don't get pushed out. The countries that want to be spacefaring, that are very circumspect about US and EU regulations on space, and many perceive that as an objective to keep them from ever getting to space. It's all education. And, you know, Dave was talking just a minute ago or a little bit ago about on-orbit servicing and where we're getting at that point. And the regulatory regime is not set up to address that. And in fact, the norm is to avoid conjunction events, right? That's what we want to do. And if you go to Space Track, you can actually see how close objects are calculated to be with one another. So the narrative right now, or the norm, is stay away from one another. And the on-orbit servicing is quite the opposite. So not unlike other areas of law, the law is playing catch up to the technology, and that's what we all need to work on.
Mm-hmm. And is it true in the Artemis Accords that there will be some requirements to responsibly deorbit satellites at end of life that are built into their life expectancies?
So the Artemis Accords are, I mean, yes, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. The U.S. has just reduced the FCC, and I know some people disagree with this, but the FCC reduced the amount of time that when you get to end of life, basically you were supposed to have 25 years to either deorbit if you could do so safely, or move to a graveyard orbit and just push it out where it's not going to bother anybody. 25 years. And when you think about it, and the fact, since the first set of 60 Starlink satellites in May of 2019, the number of operational satellites have nearly doubled, all basically Starlink satellites. 25 years is a long time if that increase in the number of satellites increases, which if Starlink has its way, it's going to continue to increase. So they've reduced that to 5 years. That's the FCC here. The Artemis Accords are a way to try to modernize the treaties. There are 5 UN space treaties. The last one was the Moon Agreement, which the United States did not sign, and that was the early 1980s. So we've been 40 years without a space treaty. So the Artemis Accords was the U.S. objective to start to modernize international policy, and they've got a number of countries on. There's one interesting dynamic, though, and the Artemis Accords and U.S. law and the law in about 3 or 4 other countries are diametrically opposed to one element of the Moon Agreement, and that relates to space resources. The Moon Agreement says that anything that you obtain from space, if it's a moon rock, if it's portions of an asteroid that you take back from landing on it, it's all humankind's ownership, that nobody owns anything. The UN, the Outer Space Treaty, makes very clear that like celestial objects like the planets, the moon, are the province of all humankind, but the Moon Agreement extended that to even dust, let's say. The US disagrees because it sees commercial opportunities in space mining. Luxembourg disagrees. You might wonder why Luxembourg. We'll let that be a question that can be answered later. Japan, I believe, and then the UAE are the countries that have laws consistent with the US and the Artemis Accords. So the Artemis Accords are kind of modernizing space policy on an international scale, but the US is directing that.
Okay. I know when I saw the Starlink for the first time, I'm aging myself here, I thought Skynet. Anyone else, if you've seen it? Okay, Terminator reference. This can be all very overwhelming, the legalities, but in the spirit and some of the things that we might think, or there might be some hindrance to putting our innovations on board or getting them to space. But actually, and in the spirit of our panelist who is missing, Monir, we want to definitely explain and invite, and Ken, I'd love for you to step in and allow us to understand how the process of getting research to space is not only more and more accessible, but more and more necessary, especially for US students and US companies.
So I think we're ultimately destined to spend more time in space, going to the moon, going beyond. I don't think Elon Musk's plan of creating Mars as a safe haven, I don't think that's practical. If we mess this up, there's not a lot of hope for us. But at the same time, I think there are opportunities, and that's really what we shoot for, commercial opportunities to do things in space, like a GPS or technologies that are look-down technologies are important to us. That's one area that people make money, and there's opportunity for us. But I also think utilizing microgravity to do things, and they've found trends. It's almost like a new science where they're figuring out that you can grow larger crystals or more uniform crystals in space. And there's no good way to generate a microgravity environment for any real length of time terrestrially. So that's how we're trying to take advantage of it, and it has been facilitated. There's money from the White House directly, or through NASA or other NSF, NIH granting agencies to fund research in space. And people are looking for that golden nugget, right? So they're looking for the Sutter's Mill. And I think that once that one thing is found, there won't be, and this is what NASA and the government's trying to get to, is a point where they don't have to support a space station anymore, where it is supported through economic efforts. People are making money off it, and you just got to get out of their way. So I think that's what they're headed for. But there's costs. Right now, if you had a way to turn lead into platinum, but it could only be done in space, it was not worth your time. Even lead into gold would be tight, because it's still costing us about $25,000 to $35,000 a kilo to get anything up there. And there's other costs. We talked about debris, talking about big satellites, that's one thing. But I remember years ago, a chip of plastic, painted plastic, hit the windshield of a space shuttle and cracked it. And the windshields on a space shuttle are like 6-7 inches thick. So the differential in speed is at least potentially 17,000 to 34,000 miles per hour. That is going to make a real impact, right, on anything it touches. So I think we do have to think about these things. The Accords are part of it, but it's also about what are the things, how do we want to be as a society? What do we see the future? where are we going? And then how are we inclusive? How do you bring in countries like Luxembourg, which won't have its own space program? How do you invite them to be part of that as well?
Yeah. And if Monir were here, I know because he represents the International Space Station National Laboratory, he would invite all folks who are innovative, who have research, to entertain the idea of the application of the process, because they have the resources that walk you step by step through what options are to potentially be on board or be in the microgravity environment. And they have numerous resources and educational opportunities that allow you to partner with or perhaps even put payload on board.
Yeah, you can approach NASA directly. There's a program, and their in-space production applications program is one direct route. You can go to CASIS directly and just say, hey, they put out solicitations, give us a project. If it wins award, we'll pay for your costs plus someone like me to implement it and put it up there. And then you can come to people like me directly. So there's a lot of different modes to do that, especially in the United States. So when the station was being built, different countries got a different percentage, they owned a piece of the property. The United States put in about half the total cost. So we own half that thing. And that means we have half of all the astronauts that are ever put up there are US astronauts. Half of all the flights going up there are supplying US material, and that's experiments as well as food and other things. So if you're a US citizen, you have a great shot at it. Other countries do too, just to a lesser extent.
All right. Well, before we turn it over for questions, is there anything you'd like to invite in the last comments so we can better understand how we can be innovative in the space industry? David?
Sure. I'd like to maybe amplify some of my earlier comments just with respect to using small satellites for innovation, because they are very inexpensive. And when we talk about small satellites, that ranges from something called a CubeSat, which is about this big, to things that are maybe the size of one of those tables. But with the smaller satellites, they're much less, I should say they're much more cost effective and affordable to get into space. And so it's quite possible to put experiments into a small form factor. And they could be biological experiments, they could be Earth observation experiments, they could be material science experiments, and launch those into space. And they can experience a variety of different environments in space, not just microgravity, but for example, on the International Space Station, you're in a low Earth orbit, which is a relatively benign place. It's not a very harsh radiation environment. The small satellites can go to other orbits that have different environments. And so, for example, you could put it into a polar orbit and experience the solar wind, which is being funneled by the Earth's magnetic fields, and you have a much higher radiation environment, for example. And so that actually allows you to put different kinds of experiments into space and develop new technologies in a relatively cost-affordable way. NASA even has a program called the CubeSat Launch Initiative, which is open to students and research organizations, where they will fund the cost of putting your small satellite or your CubeSat into space. And so you really only have to worry about building the hardware itself.
All right. If there's any other opportunities for questions, we'd love to open it up from anyone who has a question.
We've solved the world's problems.
Yes.
Yeah, I guess so.
We're good.
So one thing to point out is, space law has been a thing, as was pointed out, but committed lawyers to space law is becoming a bigger thing. But I'm a chemist, lawyer. The jobs that you'd normally do on the ground, you'd think of, hey, I'm going to go do geology. Those are becoming things that we're hiring. People in the industry are hiring. We just won a contract to build a certain type of landing pad on the moon. And my first question as the chief scientist to a bunch of engineers, because that's who, NASA and all these organizations are really engineering organizations. what is the dirt made of? Do you have samples of the dirt? Well, they don't call it dirt, they call it regolith. But, are you doing those studies? Do you have a geologist? Because depending where you land on the moon, you're going to need someone who's a lunar geologist to tell you what that regolith is made of. So people who are geologists who think, oh, I'm just going to go out into the Utah desert are now going to be on our team. And I think that's what you're starting to see. It's not just democratizing the ability to get up there, it's also changing the way people get jobs and ultimately the types of work they'll do. And we need skilled people who are skilled in the art of what they do to come and work for us or with us to do these things in space. So that's for me, the kind of, as a kid, I went and saw a early shuttle on the back of a 747 out at Edwards. Wow. And that was, you were way in the back and you saw it and it was there for like 45 seconds and it disappeared beyond the hills. And that was it. That was my exposure to NASA, really. And now they're calling us up, hey, we need to do something and you are the expert in chemistry on this thing. Can you help us understand that and take it forward? So it's really a great opportunity for people in this day and age, for sure.
When I think about the various technologies that are the hot technology areas these days, people are typically talking about, Internet of Things, autonomous vehicles, machine learning, and artificial intelligence. There are a number of these hot technologies. Blockchain is another one. The fascinating thing about space is every single one of those technologies is applicable to space. And it is an area for intense innovation because of the challenges of the environment. So let me give you an example. If I think about an Internet of Things device, okay, it's typically something that's deployed into a remote location. It's going to be hard to get to. It will have sensors collecting data about the environment that it's in. It quite likely could be a very harsh environment, so it has to be designed to withstand that harsh environment. It has to connect to a network to transmit that data back to a central processing facility where that information can be processed and understood and turned into information. So what I've just described to you is in fact a small satellite, because every single one of those attributes applies to the small satellites, and even more so. So again, all of these technologies that are hot areas for development apply directly to space.
Yeah. I see we have a question.
Yeah, really interesting conversation here. It just brings me back 30 years when I was at Harvard as a postdoc and as a NASA space fellow and looking at biology in space. And at that time, one of the big questions is, can you grow plants in space so that astronauts can eat without bringing, prepackaged stuff? Conceptual things like that. And, fast forward 30 years, I'm still wondering, in terms of biology, has space research brought anything back to Earth for Earth applications? All the applications I saw 30 years ago was so that people can live better in space. It was unidirectional. Has anything come back that was practical?
So there's one thing.
Let me count the ways.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so we talked about things like GPS, which you're bringing, right?
Yeah,
and
this is biology.
For biology?
Yeah, for
on the biology side.
yeah.
So something's been brought back. So the studies that I've seen on like plant biology have been about going to space because you want to understand how a plant under a different environment will express its genetics, right? So that's been done. And to my knowledge, nobody has taken something from that and said, hey, this is what I'm going to do. I think and you'd be talking to like, who would do that work? This is the problem we run into. I'll tell you totally honestly. The people who would be interested are seed producers. Mm-hmm. They're not agricultural companies. Ag companies in the United States or the world, they really make fertilizers and pest control systems. The people who create the next generation of plants that produce better oranges or whatever, those are seed producers. They don't have the money. They don't have the money for that high-end research. So what you're hoping is that something NASA funds for the astronauts is developed as a new piece of knowledge, and somebody at the seed company says, I'll use that. And It hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, because the other thing that even 30 years ago, people say bone loss in space, right? Maybe that could be, any findings can be used for osteoporosis, but bone loss in space is not a disease. It's bone loss in space. It's not the same as osteoporosis.
That's right.
So I'm not sure where the connection, has gone.
So for things like bone loss in space, what it has come down to is when you generate, so you're at a pharmaceutical company and you want to generate a model, a mouse model for a disease like bone loss, you do it genetically or you induce it through drugs, because mice usually don't have bone loss. They don't get osteoporosis like humans do in the same way. So that requires you to change them somehow in a way that could be drastic and impact your results. Whereas you could go test your drug on a mouse in space where it's totally natural. Their bone loss is due to their environment, not, you didn't genetically modify them, whatever. Those are the types of things that people are looking at. They're looking at generating models through that. And there's other things that we've noticed. Astronauts come back from space. NASA doesn't talk about it, but they tend to get sick. Okay? Their immune system has started to fail. And there's a very high number of people who come back and get, what is it when you've had chicken pox and then later you get?
Shingles.
Shingles. A lot of the male astronauts come back and get shingles. Disproportionately number. Why? Their immune system has failed. So a lot of people have started to look at that. Why is it failing? And can we learn something from that then we can use to improve our approach to dealing with those similar immunodeficiency related diseases on the ground? That's what I think you're going to see. But you bring up a really good point. It's getting more towards, I said that if you're going to make gold in space, it costs so much to get the lead up there, it's not even worth it. The real value is data. That's the thing that has no mass and has tons of value. And that's what you're going to see a lot of. You're going to see people come back. It's not the plant we brought back, it's the knowledge we brought back that we're able to leverage. That's my prediction.
And before the next question I see, we have a couple more. I do want to mention and recommend Gardeners of the Galaxy. It's a podcast where each week she talks about how we're growing things in space, who's growing them, and how they are benefiting us on Earth. And I will also say, as an analog astronaut, radishes still taste bad. Whether they're in space or on Earth, we tried to grow them in our remote location, and radishes are just hardy, grow well, don't taste any better.
Could I just
yes,
add
you had
one
something.
comment really quickly? The interesting thing is that if you go to any of the conferences where NASA has a booth and so forth, NASA has a portfolio of patents based on the technology that's been developed in space and in other applications that it will license, and it's pushing industry to license. They want industry to license the patents that they have and to utilize them. And so there's a mine of already a number of things that could be used that is just waiting for the opportunity.
Great point. Spin-offs, fantastic. Yes, your question.
Yeah, so the question I was going to ask is, if we stopped all human activity of greenhouse gas generation, it's estimated that it would take hundreds, if not thousands of years to get back to CO2 level and surface temperatures of pre-industrial levels. What is there, or what can we do from space to modulate the temperature on Earth and perhaps even generate electricity for Earth using space-based systems?
Oh, that's a very large topic.
Yeah.
The first thing I'll say is that the knowledge that we have about the CO2 levels and just climate change in general is coming from space. So all of that is based on data retrieved from Earth observation systems, and that's helping us to monitor what's going on, what the changes are, and how things will be developing in the future. So just having that knowledge in the first place will help us in the long term. And there was another comment that just slipped out of my mind. Sorry.
While he's thinking about it. So one of the things that so I work for an aerospace company called Redwire, and we're a group of separate aerospace companies that were all purchased by the same private equity firm. So one of the groups, they build solar panels, and we make very large solar arrays, bigger than can be constructed and flown. So they are rolled up like a carpet, and then the new ones being put on the space station, we're building those in Santa Barbara, California. And we're looking at these very large systems. And also this whole point of being able to fix a satellite leads you to the next step, which is could you just build satellites in space that would never have the experience of being in a gravity environment or have to be flown. You just put them all together so they can be very slender and thin and light and make a huge array. And then there's technology for transferring power without cables, right? So there's going to be a point in the future where I can see us having a huge array that's been put in space, maybe not in low Earth orbit, but in some, geosynchronous or a moderate orbit that powers things on the ground without us having to generate that power, right? The ability to capture solar radiation is much better. And so I think that's part of it. I think there's trouble with us going in and saying, well, we'll just shade the Earth. There's other things that come from that, right? And humanity is notorious for, oh, well, we'll fix that problem by doing this. And then other things we did not, right? It's a huge system that has to be understood. And we've been messing with it in ways that we don't really understand how it's all going to end up. So I think that's part of it. But the space station itself can be looked at in the same way. We send things to the space station without unknowingly. You've got human beings and you've got their life support system. And the Russians constantly will send up a new piece of equipment that they've wiped down with some material so that it won't rust and the tubing won't crack. And that stuff gets into the air on station, into the water supply, and then it kills their life support system. That has happened a couple of times. And it was all because they didn't think about it. And if you kill the life support system, you kill all the people. So we're getting better at understanding systems, and I think the station as a microcosm of that will help us understand ways that maybe we can address some of the bigger issues that we're dealing with.
I have frequently thought that one of the advantages or one of the outcomes of having a colony on the moon or Mars or someplace like that is, in fact, the biological technologies and the ecological technologies that will come out of that being a self-sustaining, self-supporting system. Because the feedback loops and so forth will be much smaller, and we can immediately see what the effects are, like Ken was just describing. And that will help us understand how to modulate the same loops on the massive biosphere that we live in on this planet.
Yeah, we just found recently living bacterial organisms on the outside of the window of station. Unbelievable. We find that in the tubes, the volcanic tubes in Hawaii, there are extremophile active organisms that live without sun and without an atmosphere or very little atmosphere. And we think that those will exist in the same lava tubes on Mars. So we got to get underneath that surface. So it's phenomenal what we have yet to discover and know. And I know working at NASA, the toilet and the air filtration system was always on the fritz, always. Do we have a question in the back? So if you can solve a toilet problem, maybe that's like the next Bitcoin to invest in. In the back, there was a question. Please stand up.
Sure. So there's a general trend of all these upcoming technologies being labeled as important to national security, like quantum, clean tech, et cetera. Space tech has always been intertwined with national security, but I always got the impression that there's still room for collaborating with Russia or China for space debris or bring astronauts to ISS. Do you see that trend reversing of us becoming more nationalistic or more, I guess, concerned about national security with respect to space technologies? Or do you think it's still sort of maintained that cross-border collaboration mindset?
I think primitive tribal differences will have to be overcome. Space is a collaborative enterprise, and for us to really thrive in space and become a truly spacefaring civilization, we're going to have to overcome those differences and really collaborate with each other.
I think the International Space Station right now proves that it is the largest peacetime effort that we've had in human history. And it's 25 years now old, and that's phenomenal. So if we can do that on ISS, why can't we expand that? Any other comments?
Yeah, and I would say too that I think that we'll find, if we haven't already found, that collaboration is in the interest of national security. So, you know, you're going to have, like I think they just found, I forget if they were with the Navy or one of the military branches, leaks and so forth. You're going to have that all the time. But I think that as we move forward, particularly with space and collaborative with the EU, the UK, and some of our other international partners, that national security will require the collaboration. And again, going back to one of the comments that I made before, collaboration with industry between companies and in different countries is also going to be needed in that regard. And there's some legislation that the House Commerce Committee is quietly circulating. Nobody's name is on it right now. And I don't know if you all saw Will Ferrell try to do James Lipton on Saturday Night Live, and it was always, you know, it was when he'd do the actor's studio and he'd ask the question, is it craft or is it crap? And that piece of legislation is a piece of crap, putting it, because it does everything. It's trying to undo everything in U.S. Space policy, not only with respect to the regulations, creating a presumptive that we can trust industry at whatever it says. And I represent people in the industry, but I've also come from being an attorney in the internet space, and the internet industry, other industries. You can't trust industry to regulate it itself. And so I think that for national security, circling back to your question, we are going to need that collaboration. And I think that we need to be wary of legislation and other efforts to try to create a nationalistic perspective. So anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Charles, Ken, David, thank you for your insight today. And Felix, thank you for having us. I see that we are done. Thank you.